The 20th century and after. 1914-18, World War. 1922, James Joyce's Ulysses, T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland. 1929, Stock Market Crash, Great Depression begins. 1939-45, World War II. 1947, India and Pakistan become independent nations. 1953, premiere of Samuel Beckett's Waiting for Godot. 1957-62, Ghana, Nigeria, Uganda, Jamaica, and Trinidad and Tobago become independent nations. 1958, Chinua Achebe's Things Fall Apart. 1991, collapse of the Soviet Union. 2001, attacks destroy World Trade Center. Historical background. The roots of modern literature are in the late 19th century. The aesthetic movement, with its insistence on art for art's sake, assaulted middle-class assumptions about the nature and function of art. Rejecting Victorian notions of the artist's moral and educational duties, aestheticism helped widen the breach between writers and the general public, resulting in the alienation of the modern artist from society. This alienation is evident in the lives and work of the French symbolists and other late 19th century bohemians who repudiated conventional notions of respectability, and it underlies key works of modern literature, such as James Joyce's Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man and T.S. Eliot's Wasteland. The growth of public education in England as a result of the Education Act of 1870, which finally made elementary schooling compulsory and universal, led to the rapid emergence of a mass literate population, at whom a new mass-produced popular literature and new cheap journalism, the yellow press, were directed. The audience for literature split up into highbrows, middlebrows, and lowbrows, and the segmentation of the reading public, developing with unprecedented speed and to an unprecedented degree, helped widen the gap between popular art and art esteemed only by the sophisticated and the expert. This breach yawned ever wider with the 20th century emergence of modernist iconoclasm and avant-garde experiment in literature, music, and the visual arts. Queen Victoria's contemporaries felt her jubilee in 1887 and, even more, her diamond jubilee in 1897 marked the end of an era. The reaction against middle-class Victorian attitudes that is central to modernism was already underway in the 2 decades before the Queen's death in 1901. Samuel Butler savagely attacked the Victorian conceptions of the family, education, and religion in his novel TLTE Way of All Flesh, completed in 1884. Posthumously published in 1903, the bitterest indictment in English literature of the Victorian way of life. And the high tide of anti-Victorianism was marked by the publication in 1918 of a classic of ironic debunking, Lytton Strachey's collection of biographical essays Eminent Victorians. A pivotal figure between Victorianism and modernism, Thomas Hardy marked the end of the Victorian period and the dawn of the New Age in The Darkling Thrush, a poem originally titled By the Century's Deathbed and postdated December 31, 1900, the last day of the 19th century. The poem marks the demise of a century of relative conviction and optimism, and it intimates the beginnings of a new era in its skeptical irresolution, its bleak sense of the modern world as hard and dry favorite adjectives of later writers such as Ezra Pound and T.E. Hume. The land's sharp features seemed to be the century's corpse outleaned, his crypt the cloudy canopy, the wind his death lament. The ancient pulse of germ and birth was shrunken hard and dry, and every spirit upon earth seemed for powerless as I. This poem and other works by Hardy, A. E. Housman, and Joseph Conrad exemplify the pessimism of imaginative writing in the last decade of the 19th century and the first decade of the 20th. Stoicism, a stiff upper lip determination to endure whatever fate may bring, also characterizes the literature written in the transitional period between the Victorian era and modernism, including the work of minor authors such as Robert Louis Stevenson and Rudyard Kipling. By the dawn of the 20th century, traditional stabilities of society, religion, and culture seemed to have weakened, the pace of change to be accelerating. The unsettling force of modernity profoundly challenged traditional ways of structuring and making sense of human experience. Because of the rapid pace of social and technological change, because of the mass dislocation of populations by war, empire, and economic migration, because of the mixing in close quarters of cultures and classes in rapidly expanding cities, modernity disrupted the old order, upended ethical and social codes, cast into doubt previously stable assumptions about self, community, the world, and the divine. Early 20th century writers were keenly aware that powerful concepts and vocabularies were emerging in anthropology, psychology, philosophy, and the visual arts that reimagined human identity in radically new ways. Sigmund Freud's seminal interpretation of dreams was published in 1900, and soon psychoanalysis was changing how people saw and described rationality, the self, and personal development. In his prose and poetry, D.H. Lawrence adapted the Oedipus complex to interpret and present his relationships with his parents, though rejecting Freud's negative definition of the unconscious. By the time of his death in 1939, Freud had become, as W. H. Auden wrote in an elegy for him, a whole climate of opinion / under whom we conduct our different lives. Also in the early 20th century, Sir James Fraser's Golden Bough, 1890-1915, and other works of anthropology were altering basic conceptions of culture, religion, and myth. Eliot observed that Fraser's work influenced our generation profoundly, and the critic Lionel Trilling suggested that perhaps no book has had so decisive an effect upon modern literature as Fraser's. For both anthropologists and modern writers, Western religion was now dissented by being placed in a comparative context as one of numerous related mythologies, with Jesus Christ linked to primitive fertility gods thought to die and revive in concert with the seasons. Furthering this challenge to religious doctrine were the writings of Friedrich Nietzsche, the 19th century German philosopher who declared the death of God, repudiated Christianity, and offered instead a harshly tragic conception of life. People look deeply into the true nature of things and realize that no action of theirs can work any change, but they nevertheless laugh and stoically affirm their fate. W. B. Yeats, who remarks in a 1902 letter that his eyes are exhausted from reading that strong enchanter, greets death and destruction in a Nietzschean spirit of tragic exaltation. These profound changes in modern intellectual history coincided with changes of a more mundane sort, for everyday life was also undergoing rapid transformation during the first years of the 20th century. Electricity was spreading, cinema and radio were proliferating, and new pharmaceuticals such as aspirin were being developed. As labor was increasingly managed and rationalized, as more and more people crowded into cities, as communications and transportation globalized space and accelerated time, literature could not stand still, and modern writers sought to create new forms that could register these profound alterations in human experience. This was a period of scientific revolution, as exemplified in German physics by Max Planck's quantum theory, 1900, and Albert Einstein's theory of relativity. 1905, and T.S. Eliot reflects the increasing dominance of science when he argues that the poet surrenders to tradition and thus extinguishes rather than expresses personality. It is in this depersonalization that art may be said to approach the condition of science, he claims, adding that the mind of the poet is the shred of platinum that catalyzes change but itself remains inert, neutral, and unchanged, tradition and the individual talent. The early 20th century also brought countless advances in technology. The first wireless communication across the Atlantic occurred in 1901, the Wright brothers flew the first airplane in 1903, and Henry Ford introduced the first mass-produced car, the Model T or Tin Lizzie, in 1913. Not that modern writers univocally embraced such changes. Although some were more sanguine, many modern writers were paradoxically repulsed by aspects of modernization. Mass-produced appliances and products, such as the gramophone and canned goods, tins, are objects of revulsion in Eliot's wasteland, for example. Because scientific materialism and positivism, according to which empirical explanations could be found for everything, were weakening the influence of organized religion, many writers looked to literature as an alternative. His simple-minded Protestantism spoiled by science, Yeats says in his autobiography, he made a new religion, almost an infallible church of poetic tradition. Whether or not they welcomed the demise of tradition, habit, and certitude in favor of the new, modern writers articulated the effects of modernity's relentless change, loss, and destabilization. Things fall apart, Yeats wrote, the center cannot hold. Eliot describes in four quartets his quest for the still point of the turning world. The modernist drive to make it new in Ezra Pound's famous slogan thus arises in part out of an often ambivalent consciousness of the relentless mutations brought by modernization. The position of women, too, was rapidly changing during this period. The Married Women's Property Act of 1882 allowed married women to own property in their own right, and women were admitted to universities at different times during the latter part of the century. Since the days of Mary Wollstonecraft, women in Great Britain had been arguing and lobbying for the right to vote, but in the first decades of the 20th century, Emmeline Pankhurst and her daughter Christabel encouraged suffragettes, as they were known, to take a more militant approach, which included boycotts, bombings, and hunger strikes. The long fight for women's suffrage was finally won in 1918 for women 30 and over, and in 1928 for women 21 and over. These shifts in attitudes toward women, in the roles women played in the national life, and in the relations between the sexes are reflected in a variety of ways in the literature of the period. Britain's modern political history begins with the Anglo-Boer War, 1899-1902, fought by the British to establish political and economic control over the Boer republics, self-governing states, of South Africa. It was an imperial war against which many British intellectuals protested and one that the British in the end were slightly ashamed of having won. The war spanned the reign of Queen Victoria, who died in 1901, and Edward VII, who held the throne from 1901 to 1910. This latter decade is known as the Edwardian period, and the king stamped his extrovert and self-indulgent character upon it. The wealthy made it a vulgar age of conspicuous enjoyment, but most writers and artists kept well away from involvement in high society. In general, this period had no equivalent to Queen Victoria's friendship with Tennyson. The alienation of artists and intellectuals from political rulers and middle-class society was proceeding apace. From 1910, when George V came to the throne, until World War I broke out in August 1914, Britain achieved a temporary equilibrium between Victorian earnestness and Edwardian flashiness. In retrospect, the Georgian period seems peculiarly golden, the last phase of assurance and stability before the old order throughout Europe broke up in violence. Yet even then, under the surface, there was restlessness and experimentation. The age of Rupert Brooke's idyllic sonnets on the English countryside was also the age of T.S. Eliot's first experiments in a radically new kind of poetry, James Joyce's and Virginia Woolf's in radically new forms of fiction. Edwardian as a term applied to English cultural history suggests a period in which the social and economic stabilities of the Victorian age country houses with numerous servants, a flourishing and confident middle class, a strict hierarchy of social classes remained unimpaired, though on the level of ideas a sense of change and liberation existed. Georgian refers largely to the lull before the storm of World War I. That war, as the bitterly skeptical and anti-heroic work of Wilfred Owen, Siegfried Sassoon, Isaac Rosenberg, and other war poets makes clear, produced major shifts in attitude toward Western myths of progress and civilization. The post-war disillusion of the 1920s resulted, in part, from a sense of utter social and political collapse during a war in which unprecedented millions were killed. By the beginning of World War I, nearly a quarter of the Earth's surface and more than a quarter of the world's population were under British dominion, including the vast African territories acquired in the preceding 100 years. Some of the colonies in the empire were settler nations with large European populations, such as Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, and in 1907 the empire granted them the new status of dominions, recognizing their relative control over internal affairs. Over time these largely independent nations came to be known as the British Commonwealth, an association of self-governing countries. The 20th century witnessed the emergence of internationally acclaimed literary voices from these dominions, from the early century New Zealander Catherine Mansfield to the late century Australian Leigh and Canadians Alice Munro and Anne Carson. The rest of the colonies in the British Empire consisted primarily of indigenous populations that had little or no political power, but nationalist movements were gaining strength in the early years of the century as when, in 1906, the Congress movement in India first demanded Swaraj, self-rule, soon to become the mantra of Indian nationalism. In Britain imperialist and anti-imperialist sentiments often met head-on in Parliament and the press, the debate involving writers as far apart as Rudyard Kipling and E. M. Forster. A steadily rising Irish nationalism resulted in increasingly violent protests against the cultural, economic, and political subordination of Ireland to the British Crown and government. During the Easter Rising of 1916, Irish rebels in Dublin staged a revolt against British rule, and by executing 15 Irish leaders, the British inadvertently intensified the drive for independence, finally achieved in 1921-22 when the southern counties were declared the Irish Free State. The 6 counties of Northern Ireland remained, however, part of Great Britain. No one can fully understand Yeats or Joyce without some awareness of the Irish struggle for independence, and the way in which the Irish literary revival of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, with Yeats at the forefront, reflected a determination to achieve a vigorous national life culturally even if the road seemed blocked politically. Depression and unemployment in the early 1930s, followed by the rise of Hitler and the shadow of fascism and Nazism over Europe, with its threat of another war, deeply affected the emerging poets and novelists of the time. While Eliot, Lawrence, Wyndham Lewis, Yeats, Pound, and others of the older generation turned to the political right, the impotence of capitalist governments in the face of fascism combined with economic dislocation to turn the majority of young intellectuals, and not only intellectuals, in the 1930s to the political left. The 1930s were the so-called Red Decade, because only the left seemed to offer any solution in various forms of socialism, communism, and left liberalism. The early poetry of W. H. Auden and his contemporaries cried out for the death of the old gang, in Auden's phrase, and a clean sweep politically and economically, while the right-wing army's rebellion against the left-wing Republican government in Spain, which started in the summer of 1936 and soon led to full-scale civil war, was regarded as a rehearsal for an inevitable Second World War and thus further emphasized the inadequacy of politicians. Yet though the younger writers of the period expressed the up-to-date, radical political views of the left, they were less technically inventive than the first-generation modernists, such as Eliot, Joyce, and Woolf. The outbreak of World War II in September 1939 following shortly on Hitler's pact with the Soviet Union, which so shocked and disillusioned many of the young left-wing writers that they subsequently moved politically to the center, marked the sudden end of the Red Decade. What was from the beginning expected to be a long and costly war brought inevitable exhaustion. The diminution of British political power, its secondary status in relation to the United States as a player in the Cold War, brought about a painful reappraisal of Britain's place in the world, even as countries that had lost the war, West Germany and Japan, were, in economic terms, winning the peace that followed. In winning a war, Great Britain lost an empire. The largest, most powerful, best organized of the modern European empires, it had expropriated enormous quantities of land, raw materials, and labor from its widely scattered overseas territories. India, long the jewel in the imperial crown, won its independence in 1947, along with the newly formed Muslim state of Pakistan. The post-war wave of decolonization that began in South Asia spread to Africa and the Caribbean. In 1957, Ghana was the first nation in sub-Saharan Africa to become independent, unleashing an unstoppable wave of liberation from British rule that freed Nigeria in 1960, Sierra Leone in 1961, Uganda in 1962, Kenya in 1963, in the Caribbean, Jamaica and Trinidad and Tobago in 1962, Barbados and Guyana in 1966, and St. Lucia in 1979. India and Pakistan elected to remain within a newly expanded and reconceived British Commonwealth, but other former colonies did not. The Irish Republic withdrew from the Commonwealth in 1949, the Republic of South Africa, in 1961. Post-war decolonization coincided with and encouraged the efflorescence of post-colonial writing that would bring about the most dramatic geographic shift in literature in English since its inception. Writers from Britain's former colonies published influential and innovative novels, plays, and poems, hybridizing their local traditions and varieties of English with those of the empire. The names of the Nobel Prize winners Wole Soyinka, Nadine Gordimer, Derek Walcott, V.S. Naipaul, and J.M. Coetzee were added to the annals of literature in English. While Britain was decolonizing its empire, the former empire was colonizing Britain, as Louise Bennett Riley suggests in her poem Colonization in Reverse. Encouraged by the post-war labor shortage in England and the scarcity of work at home, waves of Caribbean migrants turned to and settled in the motherland, the first group on the Empire Windrush that sailed from Jamaica to Tilbury Docks in 1948. Migrants followed from India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Africa, and other regions of the new Commonwealth. Even as immigration laws became more restrictive in the 1960s, relatives of earlier migrants and refugees from these and other nations continued to arrive, transforming Britain into an increasingly multiracial society and infusing energy into British arts and literature. But people of Caribbean, African, and South Asian origin, who brought distinctive vernaculars and cultural traditions with them, painfully discovered that their official status as British subjects often did not translate into their being welcomed as full-fledged members of British society. The friction between colorblind and ethnically specific notions of Englishness prompted a large-scale and ongoing rethinking of national identity in Britain. Among the arrivals in England were many who journeyed there to study in the late 1940s and 1950s and eventually became prominent writers, such as Bennett, Soyinka, Kamau, then Edward, Brathwaite, and Chinua Achebe. In the 1970s and 1980s a younger generation of black and Asian British writers emerged, some born in the UK, some in the ex-empire including Salman Rushdie, Hanif Qureshi, John Aggard, and Carol Phillips, and in the 1990s and the first decade of the new millennium, still younger writers including Jackie Kay and Zadie Smith. London, as the capital of the empire, had long dominated the culture as well as the politics and the economy of the British Isles. London spoke for Britain in the impeccable Southern English intonations of the radio announcers of the state-owned British Broadcasting Corporation, known as the BBC, but from the end of World War II this changed. Regional dialects and multicultural accents were admitted to the airwaves. Regional radio and television stations sprang up. In the 1940s and 1950s the BBC produced a weekly program called Caribbean Voices, which proved an important stimulus to Anglophone writing in the West Indies. The Arts Council, which had subsidized the nation's drama, literature, music, painting, and plastic arts from London, delegated much of its grant-giving responsibility to regional arts councils. This gave a new confidence to writers and artists outside London. The Beatles were launched from Liverpool and has since contributed to a notable renaissance of regional literature. From the 1960s London ceased to be essentially the sole cultural stage of the United Kingdom, and though its parliament remained the sole political stage until 1999, successive governments came under increasing pressure from the regions and the wider world. After decades of predominantly Labour governments, Margaret Thatcher led the Conservatives to power in the general election of 1979, becoming thereby the country's first woman to hold the office of Prime Minister, an office she was to hold for an unprecedented 12 years. Pursuing a vision of a new, more productive Britain, she curbed the power of the unions and began to dismantle the welfare state, privatizing nationalized industries and utilities in the interests of an aggressive free market economy. Initially her policies seemed to have a bracing effect on a nation still sunk in post-war, post-imperial torpor, but writers such as Ian McEwan and Carol Churchill and filmmakers such as Derek Jarman protested that conservative reforms widened the gap between rich and poor, black and white, north and south, and between the constituent parts of the United Kingdom. Thatcher was deposed by her own party in 1990, and the Conservatives were routed in the election of 1997. The electorate's message was clear, and Tony Blair, the new Labour Prime Minister, moved to restore the rundown health service and system of state education. Honouring other of his campaign pledges, he offered Scotland its own parliament and Wales its own assembly, each with tax-raising powers and a substantial budget for the operation of its social services, and each holding its first elections in 1999. Though a commanding figure in British politics, Blair faced increasing skepticism over his justification for joining forces with the U.S.-led invasion and occupation of Iraq in 2003. Meanwhile the Labour government made significant progress toward solving the bitter and bloody problems of Northern Ireland, where, since the late 1960s, the Irish Republican Army, IRA, had waged a violent campaign for a united Ireland and against British rule, met by violent suppression by the British Army and reprisals by Protestant Unionists, who sought to keep Northern Ireland a part of the United Kingdom. In the 1990s politics finally took precedence over armed struggle in the Republican movement. In 1998 the Good Friday Agreement, also known as the Belfast Agreement, led to elections to a Northern Ireland Assembly, which met for the first time in 1999, and the leaders of the main Roman Catholic and Protestant parties were jointly awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. Although hope persisted that peaceful coexistence and substantial self-governance in Ulster could continue, disagreements between the parties over IRA weapons and alleged spying led to the suspension of the Northern Ireland Assembly and Executive Committee in 2002. Poetry. The years leading up to World War I saw the start of a poetic revolution. The Imagist movement, influenced by the philosopher-poet T. E. Hume's insistence on hard, clear, precise images, arose in reaction to what it saw as romantic fuzziness and facile emotionalism in poetry. Like other modernists, the Imagists somewhat oversimplified the 19th century aesthetic against which they defined their own artistic ideal, while scanting underlying continuities. The movement developed initially in London, where the modernist American poet Ezra Pound was living, and quickly migrated across the Atlantic, and its early members included Hume, Pound, H.D., Hilda Doolittle, Amy Lowell, Richard Aldington, John Gould Fletcher, and F.S. Flint. As Flint explained in an article in March 1913, partly dictated by Pound, Imagists insisted on direct treatment of the thing, whether subjective or objective. On the avoidance of all words that did not contribute to the presentation, and on a freer metrical movement than a strict adherence to the sequence of a metronome could allow. Inveighing in manifestos against Victorian discursiveness, the Imagists wrote short, sharply etched, descriptive lyrics, but they lacked a technique for the production of longer and more complex poems. Other new ideas about poetry helped provide this technique, many of them associated with another American in London, T.S. Eliot. Sir Herbert Grierson's 1912 edition of John Donne's poems both reflected and encouraged a new enthusiasm for 17th-century metaphysical poetry. The revived interest in metaphysical wit brought with it a desire on the part of pioneering poets to introduce into their work a much higher degree of intellectual complexity than had been found among the Victorians or the Georgians. The full subtlety of French symbolist poetry also now came to be appreciated. It had been admired in the 1890s, but more for its dreamy suggestiveness than for its imagistic precision and complexity. At the same time, modernist writers wanted to bring poetic language and rhythms closer to those of conversation, or at least to spice the formalities of poetic utterance with echoes of the colloquial and even the slangy. Irony, which made possible several levels of discourse simultaneously, and wit, with the use of puns, banished from serious poetry for more than 200 years, helped achieve that union of thought and passion that Eliot, in his review of Grierson's Anthology of Metaphysical Poetry, 1921, saw as characteristic of the metaphysicals and wished to bring back into poetry. A new critical movement and a new creative movement in poetry went hand in hand, with Eliot the high priest of both. He extended the scope of imagism by bringing the English metaphysicals and the French symbolists, as well as the English Jacobean dramatists, to the rescue, thus adding new criteria of complexity and elusiveness to the criteria of concreteness and precision stressed by the imagists. Eliot also introduced into modern English and American poetry the kind of irony achieved by shifting suddenly from the formal to the colloquial, or by oblique allusions to objects or ideas that contrasted sharply with the surface meaning of the poem. Nor were Eliot and the imagists alone in their efforts to reinvent poetry. From 1912 D.H. Lawrence began writing poems freer in form and emotion, wanting to unshackle verse from the constraints of the gem-like lyric and approach even a insurgent naked throb of the instant moment. Thus between, say, 1911, the first year covered by Edward Marsh's Anthologies of Georgian Poetry, and 1922, the year of the publication of The Wasteland, a major revolution occurred in English and for that matter American poetic theory and practice, one that determined the way in which many poets now think about their art. This modernist revolution was by no means an isolated literary phenomenon. Writers on both sides of the English Channel were influenced by the French Impressionist, Post-Impressionist, and Cubist painters' radical re-examination of the nature of reality. The influence of Italian Futurism was likewise strong on the painter and writer Wyndham Lewis, whose short-lived journal Blast was meant to be as shocking in its visual design as in its violent rhetoric. The poet Mina Loy shared the futurist fascination with modernity and speed, while repudiating its misogyny and jingoism, as evidenced by her feminist manifesto. Pound wrote books about the French sculptor Henri Gaudí and the American composer George Antheil, and indeed the jagged rhythms and wrenching dissonances of modern music influenced a range of writers. Wilfred Owen wrote in 1918, "I suppose I am doing in poetry what the advanced composers are doing in music," and Eliot, while writing The Wasteland 3 years later, was so impressed by a performance of the composer Igor Stravinsky's Elie Sacre du Printemps, The Rite of Spring, that he stood up at the end and cheered. The posthumous 1918 publication by Robert Bridges of Gerard Manley Hopkins's poetry encouraged experimentation in language and rhythms, as evidenced by the verse's influence on Eliot, Auden, and the Welshman Dylan Thomas. Hopkins combined precision of the individual image with a complex ordering of images and a new kind of metrical patterning he named sprung rhythm, in which the stresses of a line could be more freely distributed. Meanwhile Yeats's remarkable oeuvre, stretching across the whole modern period, reflected varying developments of the age yet maintained an unmistakably individual accent. Beginning with the ideas of the aesthetes, turning to a tougher and spare ironic language without losing its characteristic verbal magic, working out its author's idiosyncratic notions of symbolism, developing in its full maturity into a rich symbolic and metaphysical poetry with its own curiously haunting cadences and with imagery both shockingly realistic and movingly suggestive. Yeats's work encapsulates a history of English poetry between 1890 and 1939. In his poem Remembering the Thirties, Donald Davy declared, "A neutral tone is nowadays preferred." That tone, Auden's schooly clinical tone, dominated the poetry of the decade. The young poets of the early 1930s, Auden, Stephen Spender, C. Day Lewis, Louis MacNeice, were the first generation to grow up in the shadow of the first generation modern poets. Hopkins's attention to sonorities, Hardy's experiments in stanzaic patterns, Yeats's ambivalent meditations on public themes, Eliot's satiric treatment of a mechanized and urbanized world, and Owen's par-rhymed enactments of pity influenced Auden and the other poets in his circle. But these younger poets also had to distinguish themselves from the still-living eminences in poetry, and they did so by writing poems more low-pitched and ironic than Yeats's, for example, or more individually responsive to and active in the social world than Eliot's. As World War II began, the neutral tone gave way to, as in Auden's work, an increasingly direct and humane voice and to the vehemence of what came to be known as the New Apocalypse. The poets of this movement, most notably Dylan Thomas, owed something of their imagistic audacity and rhetorical violence to the French surrealists, whose poetry was introduced to English readers in translations and in a short survey of surrealism, 1936, by David Gascoigne, one of the New Apocalypse poets. Many of the surrealists, such as Salvador Dali and André Breton, were both poets and painters, and in their verbal as well as their visual art they sought to express, often by free association, the operation of the unconscious mind. With the coming of the 1950s, however, the pendulum swung back. A new generation of poets, including Donald Davy, Tom Gunn, and Philip Larkin, reacted against what seemed to them the verbal excesses and extravagances of Dylan Thomas and Edith Sitwell, as well as the arcane myths and naughty elusiveness of Yeats, Eliot, and Pound. The movement, as this new group came to be called, aimed once again for a neutral tone, a purity of diction, in which to render an unpretentious fidelity to mundane experience. Larkin, its most notable exponent, rejected the intimidating gestures of an imported modernism in favor of a more civil and accessible native tradition that went back to Hardy, Houseman, and the Georgian pastoralists of the 1910s. Not everyone in England followed the lead of Larkin and the movement, some rejecting the movement's notion of a limited, rationalist, polished poetics. In the late 1950s and the 1960s, Ted Hughes began to write poems in which predators and victims in the natural world suggest the violence and irrationality of modern history, including the carnage of World War I, in which his father had fought. Jeffrey Hill also saw rationalist humanism as inadequate to the ethical and religious challenges of 20th century war, genocide, and atrocity, which he evoked in a strenuous language built on the traditions of high modernism and metaphysical poetry. Since the 1980s, the spectrum of Britain's poets has become more diverse in class, ethnicity, gender, and region than ever before, bringing new voices into the English literary tradition. Born in the northern industrial city of Leeds, Tony Harrison brings the local vernacular, the oral energy and resonance of Yorkshire idiom and rhythms, into contact with traditional English and classical verse. Born in Scotland to an Irish mother in a left-wing, working-class Catholic family, Carol Ann Duffy grew up amid Irish, Scottish, and standard varieties of English, and this youthful experience helped equip her to speak in different voices in her feminist monologues. Post-World War II Ireland, both North and South, was among the most productive spaces for poetry in the second half of the 20th century. Born just 2.5 weeks after Yeats died, Seamus Heaney, his most celebrated successor, responds to the horrors of sectarian bloodshed in Northern Ireland with subtlety and acute ethical sensitivity in poems that draw on both Irish genres and sonorities and the English literary tradition of Wordsworth, Hopkins, and Ted Hughes. Paul Muldoon, one of Heaney's former students in Belfast, also writes about the troubles in Northern Ireland but through eerily distorted fixed forms and multiple screens of irony, combining experimental zaniness with formal reserve. Born in the Irish Republic, even Boland has made a space within the largely male tradition of Irish verse with its standard, mythical emblems of femininity for Irish women's historical experiences of suffering and survival. The massive post-war change in the geographical contours of poetry written in English involved, in part, the emergence of new voices and styles from the old Commonwealth, or dominions, such as Canada and Australia. Self-conscious about being at the margins of the former empire, Leigh-Murray fashions a brash, playful, overbrimming poetry that mines the British and classical traditions while remaking them in what he styles his redneck Australian manner. And Carson continues Canadian poetry's dialogue with its British literary origins, imaginatively transporting, for example, the Victorian writers Charlotte and Emily Bronte into a Canadian landscape, but she also illustrates a heightened interest in U.S. poetry and popular culture, bringing into the literary mix influences that range from ancient Greek poetry to Ezra Pound and Sylvia Plath, television, and video. From the former colonies of the British Empire in the so-called Third World came some of the most important innovations in the language and thematic reach of poetry in English. Born under British rule, students of colonial educations that repressed or denigrated native languages and traditions, these post-colonial poets grew up with an acute awareness of the riches of their own cultural inheritances, as well as a deep knowledge of the British literary canon. They expanded the range of possibilities in English language poetry by hybridizing traditions of the British Isles with their indigenous images and speech rhythms, creoles, and genres. Some of these writers, such as the Nobel laureate Derek Walcott, the most eminent West Indian poet, have drawn largely on British, American, and classical European models, though Walcott creolizes the rhythms, diction, and sensibility of English language poetry. I have Dutch, nigger, and English in me, declares the mulatto hero of the schooner flight, and either I'm nobody, or I'm a nation. Other poets have emphasized even more strongly Afro-Caribbean inheritances in speech and culture. When colonial prejudices still branded West Indian English, or Creole, a backward language, a corruption of English, the Afro-Jamaican poets Claude McKay and Louise Bennett claimed its wit, vibrancy, and proverbial richness for poetry. In the late 1960s, the Barbadian Kamau, then Edward, Brathwaite revalued the linguistic, musical, and mythic survivals of Africa in the Caribbean, resources long repressed because of colonial attitudes. In poetry as well as fiction, Nigeria was the most prolific Anglophone African nation around the time of independence, said to be the golden age of letters in sub-Saharan Africa. Wole Soyinka, later the first black African to win the Nobel Prize, stretched English syntax and figurative language in poems dense with Yoruba-inspired wordplay and myth. At the same time, poets from India were bringing its great variety of indigenous cultures into English language poetry. A.K. Bamanujan's sharply etched poems interfuse Anglo-modernist principles with the South Indian legacies of Tamil and Kannada poetry. All of these poets respond with emotional ambivalence and linguistic versatility to the experience of living after colonialism, between non-Western traditions and modernity, in a period of explosive change in the relation between Western and native cultures. A century that began with the springtime of poetic innovation drew to its close with the full flowering of older poets such as Walcott, Hill, and Heaney, and the 21st century opened with welcome signs of fresh growth in English language poetry, including new books by Paul Muldoon, and Carson, and Carol Ann Duffy. Fiction. Novels loose baggy monsters, in Henry James's phrase can be, can do, can include anything at all. The form defies prescriptions and limits. Yet its variety converges on persistent issues such as the construction of the self within society, the reproduction of the real world, and the temporality of human experience and of narrative. The novel's flexibility and porousness, its omnivorousness and multivoicedness have enabled writers to take advantage of modernity's global dislocation and mixture of peoples, while meeting the challenges to the imagination of mass death and world war, of the relentless and rapid mutations in modern cultures and societies, in evolving knowledge and belief. The 20th century's novels may be divided roughly into three main subperiods: high modernism through the 1920s, celebrating personal and textual inwardness, complexity, and difficulty; the reaction against modernism, involving a return to social realism, moralism, and assorted documentary endeavors, in the 1930s, 1940s, and 1950s, and the period after the Collapse of the British Empire, especially from the time of the countercultural revolution of the 1960s, in which the fictional claims of various realisms urban, proletarian, provincial English, example northern, regional, example Scottish and Irish, immigrant, post-colonial, feminist, gay are asserted alongside, but also through, a continuing self-consciousness about language and form and meaning that is, in effect, the enduring legacy of modernism. By the end of the century, modernism had given way to the striking pluralism of postmodernism and postcolonialism. Yet the roots of the late century panoramic mix of voices and styles lay in the early part of the century, when writers on the margins of Englishness of Pole, Joseph Conrad, an Irishman, James Joyce, an American, Henry James, an Englishwoman, Virginia Woolf, and a working-class Englishman, D.H. Lawrence were the most instrumental inventors of the modernist English novel. The high modernists wrote in the wake of the shattering of confidence in the old certainties about the deity and the Christian faith, about the person, knowledge, materialism, history, the old grand narratives, which had, more or less, sustained the Western novel through the 19th century. They boldly ventured into this general shaking of belief in the novel's founding assumptions that the world, things, and selves were knowable, that language was a reliably revelatory instrument, that the author's story gave history meaning and moral shape, that narratives should fall into ethically instructive beginnings, middles, and endings. Trying to be true to the new skepticisms and hesitations, the modernists also attempted to construct credible new alternatives to the old belief systems. The once prevailing 19th century notions of ordinary reality came under serious attack. In her famous 1919 essay Modern Fiction, Virginia Woolf explicitly assaulted the materialism of the realistic Edwardian heirs of Victorian naturalist confidence, Arnold Bennett, H.G. Wells, and John Galsworthy. For Woolf, as for other modernists, what was knowable, and thus representable, was not out there as some given, fixed, transcribable essence. Reality existed, rather, only as it was perceived. Hence the introduction of the impressionistic, flawed, even utterly unreliable narrator, a substitute for the classic 19th century authoritative narrating voice, usually the voice of the author or some close substitute. Even a relatively reliable narrator, such as Conrad's Marlowe, the main narrating voice of Heart of Darkness, as of Lord Jim, dramatized the struggle to know, penetrate, and interpret reality, with his large rhetoric of the invisible, inaudible, impossible, unintelligible, and so unsayable. The real was offered, thus, as refracted and reflected in the novel's representative consciousness. Look within, Woolf urged the novelist. Reality and its truth had gone inward. Woolf's subject would be an ordinary mind on an ordinary day. The life that mattered most would now be mental life. And so the modernist novel turned resolutely inward, its concern being now with consciousness, a flow of reflections, momentary impressions, disjunctive bits of recall and half-memory, simultaneously revealing both the past and the way the past is repressed. Psychoanalysis partly enabled this concentration, to narrate the reality of persons as the life of the mind in all its complexity and inner tumult, consciousness, unconsciousness, id, libido, and so on. And the apparent truths of this inward life were, of course, utterly tricky, scattered, fragmentary, spotty, now illuminated, now twilight, now quite occluded. For Woolf, Joyce's Ulysses was a prime expression of this desired impressionistic agenda. He is concerned at all costs to reveal the flickerings of that innermost flame which flashes its messages through the brain. The characters of Joyce and Woolf are caught, then, as they are immersed in the so-called stream of consciousness, and some version of an interior flow of thought becomes the main modernist access to character. The reader overhears the characters speaking, so to say, from within their particular consciousnesses, but not always directly. The modernists felt free also to enter their characters' minds, to speak as it were on their behalf, in the technique known as free indirect style indirect libre in French. A marked feature of the new fictional selfhood was a fraught condition of existential loneliness. Conrad's Lord Jim, Joyce's Leopold Bloom and Stephen Dedalus, Lawrence's Paul Morrell and Rearkin, and Woolf's Mrs. Dalloway were people on their own, individuals bereft of the old props, church, ribble, ideological consensus, and so doomed to make their own puzzled way through life's labyrinths without much confidence in belief, in the knowable solidity of the world, above all in language as a tool of knowledge about self and other. Jacob of Woolf's Jacob's room remained stubbornly unknowable to his closest friends and loved ones, above all to his novelist. The walls and cupboards of Rhoda's room in the Waves, also by Woolf, bent disconcertingly around her bed. She tries in vain to restore her sense of the solidity of things by touching the bottom bed rail with her toes. Her mind pours out of her, the very boundaries of herself soften, slip, dissolve. The old conclusive plots, everything resolved on the novel's last page, on the model of a detective story, gave place to irresolute open endings, the unending vista of the last paragraph in Lawrence's Sons and Lovers, the circularity by which the last sentence of Joyce's Finnegan's Wake hooks back to be completed in the novel's first word, so that reading simply starts over. Novelists build modern myths on the dry bones of the old Christian ones. In his review of Ulysses, Order and Myth, 1923, T.S. Eliot famously praised the novel for replacing the old narrative method by a new mythical method. Joyce's Irish Jew, Bloom, is mythicized as a modern Ulysses, his day's Odyssey often ironically reviving episodes in Homer's Odyssey. This manipulation of a continuous parallel between contemporaneity and antiquity was, Eliot thought, a step toward making the modern world possible for art, much in keeping with the new anthropology and psychology as well as with what Yeats was doing in verse. Such private myth-making could, of course, take worrying turns. The religion of the blood that D.H. Lawrence celebrated led directly to the fascist sympathies of his Aaron's Rod and the revived Aztec blood cult of the plumed serpent. Language and textuality, reading and writing were now central to these highly metafictional novels, which are often about writers and artists, and surrogates for artists, such as Woolf's Mrs. Ramsay with her dinners and Mrs. Dalloway with her party, producers of what Woolf called the unpublished works of women. But this self-reflexivity was not necessarily consoling. Mrs. Flanders's vision blurs and an ink blot spreads across the postcard we find her writing in the opening page of Jacob's room. Perhaps the greatest modernist example of language gone rampant, Finnegan's Wake taxes even its most dedicated readers and verges on unreadability for others. The skeptical modernist linguistic turn, the rejection of materialist externality and of the Victorians' realist project, left ineradicable traces on later fiction, but modernism's revolutions were not absolute or permanent. Ulysses and Finnegan's Wake were influential but unrepeatable. And even within the greatest modernist fictions, the worldly and the material, political and moral questions never dried up. Woolf and Joyce, for example, celebrate the perplexities of urban life in London and Dublin, and, indeed, modernist fiction is largely an art of the great city. Lawrence was preoccupied with the condition of England, industrialism, provincial life. Satire was one of modernism's recurrent notes. So it was not odd for the right-wing novelists who came through in the 1920s, such as Wyndham Lewis and Evelyn Waugh, to resort to the social subject and the satiric stance, nor for their left-leaning contemporaries who came to be seen as even more characteristic of the red decade of the 1930s, such as Graham Greene and George Orwell, to engage with the human condition in ways that Dickens or Balzac, let alone Bennett Wells Galsworthy, would have recognized as not all that distant from their own spirit. Despite the turn to documentary realism in the 1930s, the modernist emphasis on linguistic self-consciousness did not disappear. Instead, the new writers politicized the modern novel's linguistic self-consciousness. They deployed the discourse of the unemployed or of the West Midlands proletariat, for example, for political ends. The comically chaotic meeting of English and German languages in Christopher Isherwood's Berlin stories is central to the fiction's dire warning about Anglo-German politics. Newspeak in George Orwell's 1984 is the culmination of the author's nearly 2 decades of politically motivated engagement with the ways of English speakers at home and abroad. In this politicized aftermath of the modernist experiment, novelists such as Aldous Huxley and Brave New World satirically engage the socio-political moral matter of the 1930s in part through reflections on the corruptions of language. Where World War I was a great engine of modernism, endorsing the chaos of shattered belief, the fragility of language and of the human subject, the Spanish Civil War and then World War II confirmed the English novel in its return to registering the social scene and the historical event. World War II provoked a whole series of more or less realist fictions, including Evelyn Waugh's Sword of Honor trilogy, as well as powerful singletons such as Graham Greene's Ministry of Fear and Waugh's Brideshead Revisited. The new fictions of the post-World War II period speak with the satirical energies of the young demobilized officer class. Kingsley Amos's Lucky Jim set the disgruntled tone, and of the ordinary provincial citizen finding a fictional voice yet again in the new welfare state atmosphere of the 1950s, as in Alan Salito's proletarian Nottingham novel Saturday Night and Sunday Morning. Questing for new moral basis for the post-Holocaust nuclear age, William Golding published the first of many intense post-Christian moral fables with The Lord of the Flies, and Iris Murdoch the first of many novels of moral philosophy with Under the Net, both in 1954. Murdoch espoused the sovereignty of good and the importance of the novel's loving devotion to the otherness of the other person. Murdoch and Golding were consciously retrospective, as were the contemporary Roman Catholic novelists Greene, Waugh, and Muriel Spark, in their investment in moral form. But even such firmly grounded determinations could not calm the anxieties of belatedness. As the century drew on, British fiction struggled with a disconcertingly pervasive sense of posteriority-post-war flatness, post-imperial diminutions of power and influence, and the sense of the grand narratives now losing their force as never before. Some younger novelists, such as Ian McEwan and Martin Amis, son of Kingsley, became obsessed with Germany, the now accusingly prosperous old foe, and with the still haunting ghosts of the Hitlerzeit, and not least after 1989, when the Berlin Wall came down and wartime European horror stirred into vivid focus. The dereliction of the once grand imperial center, London, became a main topic for McEwan and for Amis, as well as for the later Kingsley Amis and the ex-Hozian Doris Lessing. Whereas Conrad, E. M. Forster, A Passage to India, and Jean Bhys, Wide Sargasso Sea, had been harshly accusatory about Britain's overseas behavior, now nostalgia for old imperial days shrouded the pages of Lawrence Durrell's Alexandria Quartet and Paul Scott's Raj Quartet and Staying On. Observers of English fiction worried that the only tasks left for it were to ruminate over past history and rehash old stories. The modernist Joycean strategy of resurrecting ancient narratives to revitalize present consciousness had given way to a fear that the postmodern novelist was condemned to a disabled career of parroting old stuff. On Est Parle, one is spoken, rather than speaking for oneself, thinks the main character of Julian Barnes's Flaubert's parrot, reflecting in some dismay on this dilemma. Ventriloquial reproduction of old voices became Peter Ackroyd's trademark. Worries about being merely possessed by the past came to seem central to late 20th century English fiction, as in A. S. Byatt's Possession, which is about the magnetism of past, Victorian, writers and writings. Yet this was also a time for the spectacular emergence of many robust new voices, particularly from assorted margins writers for whom the enervation at the English Centre represented an opportunity for telling their untold stories. After a sensational trial in 1960, the ban on D. H. Lawrence's erotically explicit Lady Chatterley's Lover was finally lifted, ensuring greater freedom in the narrative exploration of sexuality. Relaxing views on gender roles, the influx of women into the workplace, and the collapse of the grand patriarchal narratives also gave impetus to feminist revisionary narratives of history, and the remaking of narrative technique as more fluid and free. In the 1980s and 1990s, prominent and inventive women's voices included those of Jeanette Winterson, celebrator of women's arts and bodiliness, and Angela Carter, feminist neomythographer, reviser of fairy tales, rewriter of the Marquis de Sade, espouser of raucous and rebellious heroines. Among the chorus of voices seeking to express with new intimacy and vividness experiences once held taboo were those of uncloseted gay writers, such as Alan Hollinghurst, pioneer of the openly male homosexual literary novel of the post-World War II period, and Adam Mars Jones, short story chronicler of the HIV/AIDS crisis. The literary counterpart for political decolonization and devolution within the British Isles was the emergence of a multitude of regional and national voices outside the south of England, many deploying a vigorously local idiom, such as the Scottish novelist Irvine Welsh and the Irish writer Roddy Doyle, who reached mass international audiences through 1990s film versions of their novels Trainspotting, Welsh, and The Commitments, Doyle. While post-imperial anxieties and exhaustion seemed to beset many post-war English writers, post-colonial novelists were energetically claiming for literature in English untold histories, hybrid identities, and vibrantly creolized vocabularies. A major phase in the huge geographic shift in the center of gravity of English language fiction occurred during the post-war decolonization of much of South Asia, Africa, and the Caribbean, when Chinua Achebe's Things Fall Apart, 1958, was published, just 2 years before Nigerian independence. Retelling the story of colonial incursion from an indigenous viewpoint, Achebe's influential novel intricately represents an African community before and after the arrival of whites, in a language made up of English and Igbo words, encompassed by a narrative that enmeshes African proverbs and oral tales with English realism and modernist reflexivity. A few years later and on the eve of his natal island's independence, the Trinidad-born writer V.S. Naipaul published his first major novel, A House for Mr. Biswas, 1961, one of many works that brilliantly developed the potential of a translucent realist fiction to explore issues such as migrant identities, cross-cultural mimicry, and the spaces of colonialism. The Indian-born Salman Rushdie, more restive than Naipaul in relation to Englishness and English literary traditions, has exuberantly championed hybrid narrative forms made out of the fresh convergence of modern European fiction and third-world orality, magical realism, and polyglossia. His novels, such as Midnight's Children, 1981, and The Satanic Verses, 1988, Riley offering a Hutnification of history in South Asia and in an Asianized England. The colonies where English literature had once been used to impose imperial models of civilization now gave rise to novelists who, ironically, outstripped in imaginative freshness, cultural energy, and narrative inventiveness their counterparts from the seat of the empire. White fiction writers from the colonies and dominions, many of them women, and many of them resident in England, such as Catherine Mansfield, Doris Lessing, and Jean Rhys, had long brought fresh perspectives to the novel from the outposts of empire, each of these eminent writers sharply etching a feminist critique of women's lives diminished by subordination to the colonial order. South Africa, not least because of its fraught racial and political history, can count among its progeny some of the most celebrated fiction writers of the late 20th century. Nadine Gordimer has extended the potential of an ethical narrative realism to probe the fierce moral challenges of apartheid and its aftermath, whereas J.M. Coetzee has used self-reflexively postmodern and allegorical forms to inquire into the tangled complexities and vexed complicities of white South African experience. Late 20th century and early 21st century English fiction would have looked startlingly thin and poverty-stricken were it not for the large presence in Britain of writers of non-European origin. Like the first modern novelists, many of the novelists who have most enriched English language fiction in recent decades are migrants, émigrés, and expatriates, such as Naipaul and Rushdie, and such as the delicately ironic realist Kazuo Ishiguro from Japan and the post-surreal fabulist Wilson Harris from Guyana. Still others are the sons and daughters of non-European immigrants to Britain, such as two of the most visible exemplars of the often comically cross-cultural fiction of a new multiracial England. Hanif Qureshi and Zadie Smith, both born on the peripheries of London, Qureshi to a Pakistani father and English mother, Smith to a Jamaican mother and English father. These and other British novelists of color, giving voice to new and emergent experiences of immigration, hybridization, and cross-racial encounter, take advantage of the novel's fecund polymorphousness with little anxiety about belatedness, no fright over parroting, and no neo-modernist worries about attempting realistic encounters with the world. Drama. Late Victorians from one perspective, Oscar Wilde and Bernard Shaw can also be seen as early moderns, forerunners of the 20th century's renovators of dramatic form. The wit of Wilde's drawing-room comedies is combative and generative of paradoxes, but beneath the glitter of his verbal play are serious if heavily coded reflections on social, political, and feminist issues. Shaw brought still another kind of wit into drama, not Wilde's light-hearted sparkle but the provocative paradox that was meant to tease and disturb, to challenge the complacency of the audience. Over time the desire to unsettle, to shock, even to alienate the audience became one hallmark of modern drama. Wilde and Shaw were both born in Ireland, and it was in Dublin that the century's first major theatrical movement originated. To nourish Irish poetic drama and foster the Irish literary renaissance, Yeats and Lady Augusta Gregory founded the Irish Literary Theatre in 1899, with Yeats's early nationalist play The Countess Kathleen as its first production. In 1902 the Irish Literary Theatre was able to maintain a permanent all-Irish company and changed its name to the Irish National Theatre, which moved in 1904 to the Abbey Theatre, by which name it has been known ever since. J.M. Synge brought the speech and imagination of Irish country people into theatre, but the Abbey's 1907 staging of his play The Playboy of the Western World so offended orthodox religious and nationalist sentiment that the audience rioted. While defending Synge and other pioneers of Irish drama, Yeats also continued to write his own plays, which drew themes from old Irish legend and which, after 1913, stylized and ritualized theatrical performance on the model of Japanese no-drama. In the 1920s, Sean O'Casey brought new vitality to the Abbey Theatre, using the Easter Rising and Irish Civil War as a background for controversial plays, one of which again sparked riots, that combined tragic melodrama, humor of character, and irony of circumstance. In England T.S. Eliot attempted with considerable success to revive a ritual poetic drama with his Murder in the Cathedral, 1935, though his later attempts to combine religious symbolism with the chatter of entertaining society comedy, as in The Cocktail Party, 1950, were uneven. Despite the achievements of Yeats, Synge, O'Casey, and Eliot, it cannot be said of Irish and British drama, as it can of poetry and fiction in the first half of the century, that a technical revolution changed the whole course of literary history. The major innovations in the first half of the 20th century were on the continent. German expressionist drama developed out of the dark, psychological focus of the later plays of the Swedish dramatist August Strindberg, 1849-1912. Another worldwide influence was the epic drama of the leftist German dramatist Bertolt Brecht, 1898-1956. To foster ideological awareness, he rejected the idea that the audience should identify with the play's characters and become engrossed in its plot. The playwright should break the illusion of reality through the alienation effect, Verfremdungseffekt, and foreground the play's theatrical constructedness and historical specificity. The French dramatist Antonin Artaud, 1896-1948, also defied realism and rationalism, but unlike Brecht, his theory of the theater of cruelty sought a transformative, mystical communion with the audience through incantations and sounds, physical gestures and strange scenery. Another French dramatist, the Romanian-born Eugene Ionesco, 1909-1994, helped inaugurate the theater of the absurd just after World War II, in plays that enact people's hopeless efforts to communicate and that comically intimate a tragic vision of life devoid of meaning or purpose. In such continental drama the influences of symbolism on the later Strindberg, Marxism, on Brecht, and Surrealism, on Artaud and Ionesco, contributed to the shattering of naturalistic convention in drama, making the theater a space where linear plot gave way to fractured scenes and circular action, transparent conversation was displaced by misunderstanding and verbal opacity, a predictable and knowable universe was unsettled by eruptions of the irrational and the absurd. In Britain the impact of these continental innovations was delayed by a conservative theatre establishment until the late 1950s and 1960s, when they converged with the countercultural revolution to transform the nature of English language theatre. Meanwhile the person who played the most significant role in the Anglophone absorption of modernist experiment was the Irishman Samuel Beckett. He changed the history of drama with his first produced play, written in French in 1948 and translated by the author as Waiting for Godot, premiered in Paris in 1953, in London in 1955. The play astonishingly did away with plot, nothing happens twice, as one critic put it, as did Endgame, 1958, and Beckett's later plays, such as Not I, 1973, and That Time, 1976. In the shadow of the mass death of World War II, the plotlessness, the minimal characterization and setting, the absurdist intimation of an existential darkness without redemption, the tragicomic melding of anxiety, circular wordplay, and slapstick action in Beckett's plays gave impetus to a seismic shift in British writing for the theatre. The epicenter of the new developments in British drama was the Royal Court Theatre, symbolically located a little away from London's West End theatreland, the rough equivalent of Broadway in New York. From 1956 the Royal Court was the home of the English Stage Company. Together they provided a venue and a vision that provoked and enabled a new wave of writers. John Osborne's Look Back in Anger, 1956, the hit of the ESC's first season, significantly helped by the play's television broadcast, offered the audience lessons in feeling through a searing depiction of class-based indignation, emotional cruelty, and directionless angst, all in a surprisingly non-metropolitan setting. At the Royal Court the working-class naturalism of the so-called kitchen sink dramatists and other angry young men of the 1950s, such as Arnold Wesker, author of the trilogy Chicken Soupy with Barley, 1958, also broke with the genteel proprieties and narrowly upper-class set designs that, in one unadventurous drawing-room comedy after another, had dominated the British stage for decades. The political consciousness of the new theatre was still more evident in John Arden's plays produced for the Royal Court, such as Sergeant Musgrave's Dance, 1959, which explores colonial oppression, communal guilt for wartime atrocities, and pacifism in the stylized setting of an isolated mining town. By the later 1960s the influence of the counterculture on British theatre was unavoidable. Joe Horton challenged bourgeois sentiment in a series of classically precise, blackly comic, and sexually ambiguous parodies, such as his farce What the Butler Saw, 1969. While plays of social and political critique were one response to the post-war period, Beckett and the Theatre of the Absurd inspired another group of Royal Court writers to refocus theatre on language, symbolism, and existential realities. Informed by kitchen sink naturalism and absurdism, Harold Pinter's comedies of menace map out a social trajectory from his early study of working-class stress and inarticulate anxiety, The Room, 1957, through the film noirish black farce of The Dumb Waiter, 1960, and the emotional power plays of It. Caretaker, 1960, to the savagely comic study of middle-class escape from working class. Maurice in the Homecoming, 1965. Later plays reflect on patrician suspicion and betrayal, though in the 1980s his work acquired a more overtly political voice. Though less bleak than Pinter, Tom Stoppard is no less indebted to Beckett's wordplay, skewed conversations, and theatrical technique, as evidenced by Rosencrantz and Guildenstern Are Dead, 1967, and other plays, many of which embed within themselves earlier literary works, such as Godot and Hamlet, and thus offer virtuoso postmodernist reflections on art, language, and performance. This enjoyment and exploitation of self-conscious theatricality arises partly out of the desire to show theater as different from film and television and is also apparent in the 1970s productions of another playwright, the liturgical stylization of Peter Shaffer's Equus, 1973, and the bleak mental landscape of his Antonio Salieri in Amadeus, 1979, emphasize the stage as battleground and site of struggle, an effect lost in their naturalistic film versions. Stoppard's time shifts and memory lapses in Travesties, 1974, allow a non-naturalistic study of the role of memory and imagination in the creative process, a theme he returns to in Arcadia, 1993, a stunning double exposure account of a romantic poet and his modern critical commentators occupying the same physical space but never reaching intellectual common ground. Legal reform intensified the post-war ferment in British theatre. Since the Theatres Act of 1843, writers for the public stage had been required to submit their play scripts to the Lord Chamberlain's Office for State Censorship, but in 1968 a new Theatres Act abolished that office. With this new freedom from conservative mores and taste, Howard Branton, Howard Barker, Edward Bond, and David Hare were able to write challenging studies of violence, social deprivation, and political and sexual aggression, often using mythical settings and epic stories to construct austere tableaus of power and oppression. Bond's Lear, 1971, typifies his ambitious combination of soaring lyrical language and alienatingly realistic violence. Directors such as Peter Brook took advantage of the new freedom in plays that emphasized, as had Artaud's theater of cruelty, physical gesture, bodily movement, and ritualized spectacle. The post-1968 liberalization also encouraged the emergence of new theater groups addressing specific political agendas, many of them inspired by Brecht's epic theater's distancing, discontinuous, and socially critical style. Companies such as Monstrous Regiment, Gay Sweatshop, Joint Stock, and John McGrath 7:84 worked collaboratively with dramatists who were invited to help devise and develop shows. Increasingly in the 1970s published plays were either transcriptions of the first production or blueprints for the alchemy of live performance, Micheline Wander. In Ireland the founding of the Field Day Theatre Company in 1980 by the well-established playwright Brian Friel and actor Stephen Aurier had similar motives of collaborative cultural catalysis. Their first production, Friel's Translations, 1980, exploring linguistic colonialism and the fragility of cultural identity in 19th-century Ireland, achieved huge international success. This ethos of collaboration and group development helped foster the first major cohort of women dramatists to break through onto mainstream stages. Working with Joint Stock and Monstrous Regiment in the late 1970s on plays such as The Gender-Bending Anti-Colonial Cloud. 1979, Carol Churchill developed plays out of workshops exploring gender, class, and colonialism. She carefully transcribes and overlaps the speech of her characters to create a seamlessly interlocking web of discourse, a streamlined version of the ebb and flow of normal speech. In Top Girls, 1982, and Serious Money, 1987, plays that anatomize the market-driven ethos of the 1980s, she explores modern society with the wit and detachment of restoration comedy. Pam Jem studies the social and sexual politics of misogyny and feminism in her campy theatrical explorations of strong women Queen Christina, 1977, Piaf, 1978, Camille, 1984, while Sarah Daniels reinterprets the naturalism of kitchen sink drama by adding to it the linguistic stylization of Churchill. Massive strides in the diversification of English language theatre occurred during the era of decolonization, when two eminent poets, Derek Walcott and Wole Soyinka, helped breathe new life into Anglophone drama. As early as the 1950s Derek Walcott was writing and directing plays about Caribbean history and experience, recreating in his drama West Indian oral culture, of chants, jokes, folk songs, and fables, at a time when theatre in the Caribbean tended to imitate European themes and styles. After moving to Trinidad in 1958, he founded what came to be known as the Trinidad Theatre Workshop, and for much of the next 20 years devoted himself to directing and writing plays that included Dream on Monkey Mountain, first produced in 1967, in which Eurocentric and Afrocentric visions of Caribbean identity collide. Since then, a notable breakthrough in Caribbean theatre has been the collaborative work of the Sisterin Theatre Collective in Jamaica, which, following the lead of Louise Bennett and other West Indian poets, draws on women's personal histories in dramatic performances that make vivid use of Jamaican speech, expression, and rhythm. Meanwhile in Africa, Wole Soyinka, who had been involved with the Royal Court Theatre in the late 1950s when Brecht's influence was first being absorbed, returned to Nigeria in the year of its independence to write and direct plays that fused Euro-modernist dramatic techniques with conventions from Yoruba popular and traditional drama. His play Death and the King's Horseman, premiered in Nigeria in 1976, represents a tragic confrontation between colonial officials and the guardians of Yoruba rituals and beliefs. While Soyinka has been a towering presence in sub-Saharan Africa, other playwrights, such as the fellow Nigerian Femi Osifisan and the South African Athol Fugard, have used the stage to probe issues of class, race, and the often violent legacy of colonialism. In England, playwrights of Caribbean, African, and Asian origin or descent, such as Mustafa Matura, Carol Phillips, and Hanif Qureshi, the latter of whom is best known internationally for his screenplays for My Beautiful Laundrette, 1985, Sammy and Rosie Get Laid, 1988, My Son the Fanatic, 1998, and The Mother, 2004, have revitalized British drama with a host of new vocabularies, new techniques, new visions of identity in an increasingly cross-ethnic and transnational world. The century that began with its first great dramatic movement in Ireland was followed by a century that began with English-language drama more diverse in its accents and styles, more international in its bearings and vision than ever before. Texts. 1899, 1902 Joseph Conrad, Heart of Darkness 1910 Bernard Shaw, Pygmalion 1913 Ezra Pound, A Few Don'ts by an Imagist 1914 James Joyce, Dubliners. Thomas Hardy, Satires of Circumstance 1914-15 Blast 1916 Joyce, A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man 1917 T.S. Eliot, The Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock. 1918 Gerard Manley Hopkins, Poems 1920 D.H. Lawrence, Women in Love. Wilfred Owen, Poems 1921 William Butler Yeats, Michael Robarts and the Dancer 1922 Catherine Mansfield, TLTE Garden Party and Other Stories. Joyce, Ulysses. Eliot, The Wasteland. 1924 Forster, A Passage to India 1927 Virginia Woolf, To the Lighthouse 1928 Yeats, The Tower 1929 Woolf, A Room of One's Own. Robert Graves, Goodbye to All That 1935 Eliot, Murder in the Cathedral. Contexts. 1900 Max Planck, Quantum Theory 1901 First wireless communication across the Atlantic 1901-10 Reign of Edward VII 1902 End of the Anglo-Boer War 1903 Henry Ford introduces the first mass-produced car. Wright brothers make the first successful airplane flight 1905 Albert Einstein, Theory of Special Relativity. Impressionist Exhibition, London 1910 Post-Impressionist Exhibition, London 1910-36 Reign of George V 1914-18 World War I 1916 Easter Rising in Dublin 1918 Armistice. Franchise Act grants vote to women 30 and over 1920 Treaty of Versailles. League of Nations formed 1921-22 Formation of Irish Free State with Northern Ireland, Ulster, remaining part of Great Britain 1928 Women 21 and over granted voting rights 1929 Stock market crash, Great Depression begins 1933 Hitler comes to power in Germany. Texts. 1937 David Jones, in parenthesis 1939 Joyce, Finnegan's Wake. Yeats, Last Poems, and 2 plays 1940 W. H. Auden, Another Time 1943 Eliot, 4 quartets. 1945 Auden, Collected Poems. George Orwell, Animal Farm 1946 Dylan Thomas, Deaths and Entrances 1949 Orwell, 1984-1953 Premiere of Samuel Beckett's Waiting for Godot 1958 Chinua Achebe, Things Fall Apart 1962 Doris Lessing, The Golden Notebook 1964 Philip Larkin, The Wits on Weddings 1966 Nadine Gordimer, The Late Bourgeois World. Tom Stoppard, Rosencrantz, and Guildenstern are dead. Jean Rhys, Wide Sargasso Sea 1971 B.S. Naipaul, In a Free State 1975 Seamus Heaney, North. Contexts. 1936-39 Spanish Civil War 1936 Edward VIII succeeds George V, but abdicates in favor of his brother, crowned as George VI 1939-45 World War II 1940 Fall of France. Battle of Britain 1941-45 The Holocaust 1945 First atomic bombs dropped, on Japan 1947 India and Pakistan become independent nations 1948 Empire Windrush brings West Indians to UK. 1950 Apartheid laws passed in South Africa 1956 Suez Crisis 1957 Ghana becomes independent 1960 Nigeria becomes independent 1961 Berlin Wall erected 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis. Uganda, Jamaica, Trinidad, and Tobago become independent 1965 U.S. troops land in South Vietnam 1966 Barbados and Guyana become independent 1969 Apollo moon landing 1971 Indo-Pakistan War, leading to creation of Bangladesh 1972 Britain enters European Common Market 1973 U.S. troops leave Vietnam. Texts. 1979 Carol Churchill, Cloud 9 1980 J.M. Coetzee, Waiting for the Barbarians 1981 Salman Rushdie, Midnight's Children. Brian Friel, Translations 1985 Production of Hanif Qureishi's My Beautiful Laundrette 1988 Rushdie, The Satanic Verses 1989 Kazuo Ishijiro, The Remains of the Day 1990 Derek Walcott, Rose 1992 Thorngun, The Man with Night Sweats 1993 Tom Stoppard, Arcadia 1997 Arundhati Roy, The God of Small Things 1999 Carol Ann Duffy, The World's Wife 2000 Zadie Smith, White Teeth 2002 Paul Muldoon, Moisand, and Gravel. Contexts. 1979 Islamic Revolution in Iran, The Shah flees. Soviets invade Afghanistan 1979-90 Margaret Thatcher is British Prime Minister 1980-88 Iran-Iraq War 1982 Falklands War 1989 Fall of the Berlin Wall. Tiananmen Square, Beijing, demonstration and massacre 1991 Collapse of the Soviet Union 1994 Democracy comes to South Africa 1997 Labour Party victory in the UK ends 18 years of Conservative government 1998 British handover of Hong Kong to China. Northern Ireland Assembly established 2001 September 11 Attacks destroy World Trade Center 2002 Euro becomes sole currency in most of European Union 2003 Invasion of Iraq led by US and UK.